Hello and good evening. We are live. Welcome back. It's been a couple of days since we had our last stream. It's been kind of 3 weeks since we had our last stream. And I want to strike back. This is kind of our The Empire Strikes Back for live streaming. I want to strike back with something great, something awesome, something I've been working on for a while, and that is this thing, as you've probably seen in the title. It is a lecture on the principles of visual design, and hopefully that's going to be really, really interesting. That is the goal after all. But yeah, after all, welcome. If you're watching live, let me know that you're here. Give me a little hello, a little shout out in the chat, just so I know who is looking, because it's always just nice to look. Tonight's gonna be a little bit different. Like I said before, usually these streams we kind of go for 2 hours and then we take a break kind of in the middle. But tonight we're gonna be discussing something quite I would say not personal, but like something it's gonna be very, very structured for the entirety. We're not gonna have just like a casual stream where we're just bouncing ideas back and forth. It's a presentation, and the presentation looks like this. And there is a couple of slides going through this. I'm hoping that what's it called? That all the people watching will find something useful in it. It'll be pretty intense. If you are any kind of a designer or interested in visual design or working in the industry, something like this, I think there'll be quite a lot of useful stuff. And basically the way it's going to work is we're going to go through a bunch of core principles, and those core principles will kind of lay the foundation for some of the more complex things we have available in our available to us in visual design. So yeah, welcome everyone. Hello Schultz, hello Plexi, Rock and Stone, Hilly 100%, Marcus Kyle, ooh yes, nice seeing you yesterday. No, Blixa, hello, 40B, welcome. That's awesome. 40B is my brother, so that's just mega awkward. And Plexi writes, you always have a new haircut going on. And Blaze, of course, hello Blaze, thank you. So that's great. And if there's any people who don't want to let themselves known, that's also totally fine. But I hope that this will be exciting. I just really want to just jump into it. I'm going to put on my my headphones here. There'll be a little bit of a delay between people writing stuff and me responding to it, but I do have the chat over here on the left side, so I can see if people are in doubt of things, but I'll do my best to explain the stuff. And etc, etc, etc. Also, my face is down here on the left side, but I'm probably gonna do it like this instead, where you can't see my face, because it's very much focused on the thing. So I hope that everyone watching is comfortable. I hope everyone is excited for what's gonna happen, because it's gonna be a little bit like watching a long drawn out YouTube channel, but hopefully it's gonna be the kind of thing you can watch back and enjoy in the future. Now, a little bit of a prerequisite before starting it. The stuff that's in this lecture is based on stuff that I've learned over the past, let's say 10 years. I think that's the best way of saying it. Over the past 10 years, there's some ideas here, and then kind of slowly putting words to the things. And I'm the kind of person who really likes defining things with words, and the goal is there to make something like turn the things that we do intuitively into a tool, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So when you just do something, you probably had that experience before. You work with a designer or an artist, and like, how did you do that? And they're like, nah, I just did it, and that's great. That's how lots of things are done. But I kind of like putting words to those things, and that can be a really tricky thing to do, because there's a bunch of complexities involved. Okay, so the beginning of this lecture here. Whoa, I'm gonna get in here. Oh no, all the magic. There we go. So that's the thing here. So the beginning of the lecture is going to be part 1, and that's going to be something called the fundamentals of visual design. And here we're going to go over through some principles that is kind of very known in in lots of different design schools and stuff like this. So it might be familiar to some of those of you watching. It might also not be familiar, but it's a very important thing to go through just because it kind of lays the foundation for everything that will come after, basically. So hopefully that'll make sense. Hello, camera on screen is less intimidating. Getting a glass of wine then, nice, good job. Everest, hello there, welcome to the stream. Then in part 2, we will go over the complexities of visual design. So this is where we're gonna build on those fundamentals, and then we're gonna add some stuff to it. And for me, at least, the way I see the industry and the way design is done right now, especially for the entertainment industry, most people kind of stick to the first part. So everything we're discussing in the first part, that's kind of stuff that people know about, and the stuff that people use, and the stuff that people talk about. The stuff in part 2 is more stuff. It's more my theory. It's how I've come to look at a lot of the design stuff, and I think that's where the real interesting saucy bits lie. So hopefully that's gonna be cool. Okay, let's jump into it. Part 1, the fundamentals of visual design. In the context of this presentation, visual design means constructing visuals with a certain look and feel, texture and quality for use in the entertainment industry. I'm just going to turn off my PC sound here. Right, so that makes sense, right? So there's visual design is a very broad field. It could be graphic design, it could be illustration, all these things. But specifically, we're kind of talking about how we design visually in the entertainment industry. So entertainment industry like games, films, etc., those kind of things. Okay, let's move on here. Many of the principles can be used across industries, but the way they are formulated are specifically made to assist in the creation of visuals for games, films, comics, etc. Yeah, so that's just a continuation of that, right? So these principles can be used in other mediums, some other areas, etc., but they are in the context of this presentation is specifically for like the entertainment industry. Okay, so included in the fundamentals of design, there's this thing that I learned a way back called the elements of design. And if you are a design student, then maybe you've heard of these things. They're just called the elements of design. And they look a little bit like this. And these are called the elements of art, but basically it's the same thing. And it just means that we have these different components in art, or in design, or in visuals, that we can kind of break apart and think about as an abstract concept, and then utilize them for something, you know. It's like we could make a drawing using line, we could make a drawing using shape, we could use form, and the point of all these things is just being able to, value and abstract the ideas, you know, so we can talk about value as its own thing, just to say, okay, you have a piece of art, let's just look at the value within the piece of art, or let's just look at the color or something like that. It's a component we can extract and talk about. Now, the thing is, I was taught these 7 elements design, and if you are going online and looking for them, you're probably going to see a couple of variations. If you just search the elements of design, this is one I found, and it has point, line, shape, form, texture, color, value, and space. So there's actually 8 of them instead of 7. So already there starts breaking. And when I learned them, they didn't have the point thing. Don't know why that was the case. What's going on here with the presentation? That's weird. There we go. Okay. So there's a few variations, and if you look a little bit more, there's also some other variations where they literally just copy the one from before, and then they just replaced point with composition, and then they're like, well, that's one of the elements of design. And I understand that composition is also important, but maybe it's not really one of the elements of design or whatever. And if you keep looking, you're going to find all kinds of different interpretations of these elements of design. This one over there has lines, shapes, and then negative space, and then volume. And I kind of think that negative space is shape, but I can see what they're saying, and then volume, value, etc. And then over here on the right, you got this version with kind of line, and then it has direction, which I kind of feel like are the same thing, and then they have these principles attached to them. So there's many different ways of looking at this depending on where you're coming from, and there's no fixed rule set for how to actually think about it. The point is actually not the exact breakdown and classification of each of these elements, it is, the exact breakdown and classification of each of these elements is not what is important. What is important is your ability to use it creatively, usually in the form of creating contrast and harmony. So the exact breakdown of these visual design elements, I don't think it's that important. It's just more that you can take this abstract concept that is line and be like, okay, let's talk about the quality of line in your work, or let's talk about the quality of direction in your work. Like however you break it down, it doesn't really matter, but the visual design elements in general is just a helpful way of doing it. Now, I have my own way of breaking the stuff down, and I think this is kind of based on the stuff that I learned, and this is also just based on how I actually use it myself. And there's some caveats and some differences from maybe other stuff, but specifically for the visual design I'm doing for the entertainment, then here they are kind of, and I break them into two different categories. We have abstract elements and we have physical elements, and the abstract elements are pretty much what you'll see in the elements of art and design: line, shape, form, space, value, color, and texture. And then the physical elements we'll get to a little bit later, but there are some other things we can add. Okay, cool. So to build a strong foundation for the stuff we're gonna talk about in the future, I want to go through these different abstract elements, and maybe you're familiar with them, maybe you're not. If you're not, then maybe you learn something new. If you're familiar with them, then it's just a nice, it's just a nice update on what you already know, or just a nice refresher. Maybe be like, oh, damn it, you know what, that I forgot that. Thanks for mentioning it right now. So hopefully there'll be something useful. The abstract elements, so that's that first 7 parts. We're gonna look at those. Okay, the first thing we're gonna look at here is line. And in many ways, line is kind of the simplest way of doing visuals. It's just you have a pencil, you draw a line, and then it's kind of the simplest component. And the idea here is not to say you can use line, it is to say how can we use line differently for different effects, right? It's like, so you can see on the drawing on the left, it's a drawing by Egon Schiele. There the line quality is kind of a little bit gnarly and edgy and curly, and it makes the whole thing feel a little bit more kind of uncomfortable and shaken and whatever. And the thing in the middle is a bit more natural. Maybe it's not like realism, right? But if it's a little bit more natural, a little bit more curvy, a little bit soft, and not as uncomfortable. It's kind of pleasant to some extent. And the thing on the right is very designed, very clean, very edged, and which makes it feel, designed, sleeked, like a product in a very different way, And this is just through the quality of the line that's making these things feel that way, So we can break that down, and you can use line in such a way where it has a certain feeling just based on the quality of the line. And one of the elements of line that I like breaking down is this thing called variation, and you can use it as a sort of contrast. I think this is a really good example in this anime called Haikyuu, where all the normal characters, you can see the characters there, they have a very simple line, but then this character in the middle, this guy hitting the ball right now, he has a rough line, and it makes him really stand out in contrast to the other. It feels totally out of place, but it gives this quality of contrast, which makes it interesting to look at. I would call that thing variation. You have variation of line within the image. You can kind of imagine that if you took the upper half of this guy and put it on this thing, you would have 2 different line qualities, and they wouldn't feel very harmonious, right? But they would have a lot of contrast in the way that the line is represented, and then you could use that to your advantage to tell something in a different way. Another way of using line or thinking about line is kind of this idea of directionality. So you're just, you're seeing lines in space or seeing lines in your composition, and they can direct the eye in a certain way to a certain point. You could also have a line that makes things feel more harmonious, like you have clean lines here, and then everything here is harmonious and elegant and put together, etc., etc., etc. And the point is not that line is either this or that. It's just that you can use line as a source of visual contrast, as an idea in your head to be like, okay, let's look at this the art you're making from the point of view of line, right? So that's kind of the goal there, right? Okay, and something I really like and I dislike when other people present their stuff is that they rarely. I see a lot of stuff where people are trying to explain design or explain visuals or something, and then they only use other people's work to kind of demonstrate these principles. And like, you could do this and this and this, but then in their own work, they're not really like kind of replicating those principles. And I can't say that I'm replicating all the principles that I'm going to talk about, but I want to show you the closest thing I have to utilizing those principles. So, for example, here is and a very quick illustration I did for some visualization. And here we have this very harsh 3D background, and then the characters are kind of just drawn on top, basically with a rough line. And then there's some things, and they feel very out of place, right? Like the 2D characters do not belong in this environment versus the 3D environment, and that's insanely purposeful. Like I've done that as a conscious choice. I want that stark contrast, and it makes you look at the characters even more, just for the fact that like they have line and are rough in this way, and the background does not. So it's kind of the ultimate incarnation of line variation. No line and line. Hopefully that makes sense. But the goal of all of these things is to create contrast or harmony. And right now I'm creating a lot of contrast. Within this character, there's harmony with all the lines. All the lines feel similar, etc. There's harmony within the character, but relative to the background, there's contrast, right? And that's the whole goal, creating contrast or harmony depending on what you're trying to do. Shape. So shape, probably really familiar to lots of you. Shape is kind of this thing that you can create contrast and interest with just shapes. We'll have circles and we have a square. Obviously now you are looking at the square because it's different from the other ones, and therefore the image is interesting, etc. So shape, right? We use shape as a component, and often shape is kind of the cornerstone of kind of composition, especially in like a format like this on film or something like that. We're designing a shot, and then we're using shape to compose the things, right? We have a big shape over here, a small shape here, and a small shape here, and that makes this spot really interesting because we have a lot of contrast in the shape, right? Big shape, kind of, and a smaller shape, right? Like lots of black and a little bit of white basically going on here, and then the small shape here of the guy, right? We also have some shape contrast in the sense that we have something very rocky and hard, and then we have kind of a human, right? And the shapes are the different kinds of shapes, like if the rock also looked like a human, that would be weird. It's like a natural cliff shape versus a human shape. So in the quality of the shape, they're also different, not just these bigger shapes, right? Something you also might be familiar with is like the type of shapes, and my goal here is just like to highlight different aspects of these components and just things you can think about and maybe you hadn't thought about or whatever. And maybe you know this principle, right? That generally round things feel friendly, and that's just how they feel to us. And square things, maybe they feel strong, like this pig, and triangle things feel dangerous. And in different contexts, they can do different things, but you're probably all familiar with these things, that if you have something very spiky and gnarly, it feels evil and uncomfortable. If you have something round and squishy, it feels huggable and sweet. And we can use shape language in such a way to imply a certain thing. Similarly, also, like we have these two things here, right? It's like this is a drag race, and our brain is telling us that this thing is gonna win because it looks faster, it looks more sleek, our brain is like, this is the fast thing, this is a big square thing, it doesn't look fast, but in the drag race that thing actually works, actually wins. Like, so it's shapes can also lie, and which I think is really interesting. But you can use shapes to shapes inform the way we think about certain things. It just works that way. But we can also use them to subvert expectations, and you can do that with all the things. The point is just that shapes, they control how we experience things, and this is very common throughout design and media and stuff. Once again, I want to show you some of my work here. So in terms of kind of shape language and stuff, then I have this spaceship over here, and it has these kind of like elegant curved shapes, etc. And then it has these smaller spaceships, and it should probably be pretty obvious to you that that these things feel harmonious, right? Like they're together, right? Relative to this thing over here, these things they don't match. They're from different things, right? The shapes here are similar, they have a similar language, a similar feel, right? But the interesting thing is, I think that the shape of this itself, like if we just look at the silhouette, is actually quite close to this big thing. You know, it's got two wings here on the sides, but we don't feel like they belong. And it's because there's all these other qualities. And I think it's what's happening here is that the silhouette stopped actually becoming important, but instead the quality of the shape is what feels similar here, right? Where the quality of this shape is a different thing, even though the silhouette is the same. So just I think there's something there to pay attention to, that it's not just about the specific overall big shape and stuff like that. It's also how it qualitatively feel. Like probably most of you know how to do this and you understand it, but it's something to think about nonetheless. You know, and it's interesting because they have a lot of contrast in their silhouette, right? But then their quality shape makes them come together. Third one here is form. Form is a little bit weird to describe because it's kind of similar to shape in a way. Like there's the same kinds of contrast. You know, we got this block here, and that's one form, and then this rope is a very different kind of form, and they contrast a lot with each other. So there's kind of a little bit of excitement and play there. The same thing over here on this the statue here. We got kind of the more sleeker, clean facial part, but then the beard is very gnarly and noisy almost. So the forms are contrasting, you know, in how everything feels, and that makes it look interesting and exciting, and you're kind of paying attention here because it's the one thing that's also there's light and shadow and those kind of things, but in terms of form it's like sleek and clean, where here it's more gnarly and noisy, and it makes you pay attention there in terms of contrast. And etc. So I think lots of the same things apply to form as applies to shape, but I want to give you like a little bit of a shorthand for how to handle form, because I think it's actually really interesting. For me, there's basically like three ways of rendering or like kind of communicating form. And the first, the most basic one you know and think about is light. You know, you have light, and the light hits an object, and then the form turns, and then you get shadow and stuff like that, and then the form is rendered. You see it here in the skull, you see it here on the back, right? And you can use that to your advantage. You don't have to do something that's like physically accurate with the light. You can just have something that's kind of trying to do the form, even though it's not correct with the light, as long as the form can be seen with kind of value or with the form turning somehow, then you'll start seeing that form. And I think it's all a principle of like us being trained to see form with light from nature, right? Like the sun is shining on an object and you are used to seeing things under light, and therefore you think that form feels and looks that way, you know. Obviously very different if you're blind, then form has a very different relation to your inner and to the way that your brain understands it, right? And I think, you know, mole, like a ground mole, they're also blind, but they can clearly navigate, so they understand form in a different way than we do. But we definitely understand it through light. A different way of thinking about form is kind of this thing I call curvature, right? And this has nothing to do with light, right? It's just the fact that there's these lines drawn in space around this form, and it has a continuous way, and from that alone we can feel the form. It's nothing to do with light. It's just the form itself, you know. It's the curvature of the form, and I think that's really interesting. You can kind of use it in combination with light to kind of enhance the form even more. So all these lines are following the form itself, but there's also shadow and light, and it kind of makes the form even more evident than if maybe it didn't have these lines, you know. And it's not that you add the two together and then it's better. It's just that it's a different way of displaying form. And I think it can be really helpful if you have something that maybe has a hard time visualizing the values, because it has values on its own. You know, this tree here, it has dark bits and bright bits and medium bits and stuff, and it can actually be kind of hard to see what is shadow and what is light. Like, you know, this could almost be a shadow. You know, you've probably seen those things in the past where you don't exactly know what is what. But then it has this texture on it, like natural texture on it, and the texture helps us see the form, right? So you can use that to your advantage to highlight form in such a way, you know. And the third one here is this thing I call overlaps, you know. This has nothing to do with, you know, you could kind of say this is a little bit of curvature, but this is kind of just constructing the form as with lines essentially, right? And what's happening here is that through the use of overlaps, we, based on how we understand silhouette and how form we understand certain forms, how those things work, we can complete the form on our own, just using our knowledge. You kind of see this here on this arm here, right? Like these lines are not finishing up and connecting, right? But you still you can feel that this feels correct. You know that, yeah, this all feels right. It's because you can kind of imagine the form underneath just because of the ways that these lines are intersecting in this way, right? The lines are overlapping in such a way that you're finishing the form in your head, right? And the same thing on this thing here. You know these silhouettes, and you know that with these overlaps of lines, you'll complete the form in your head, right? So it's a different way of showing form. This is very common in animation where stuff moves and it's just line. We still feel that form and turning, but they're using clever overlaps to complete the form, you know. So there's kind of these three different ways of doing it. You can use light, you can use this kind of curvature thing, and then you can use overlaps, right? Where clever silhouettes and overlaps, they help us complete the form on our own. And I want to show, like, once again, show my own work and just say how I'm utilizing these principles. So basically, you know, obviously the form is being rendered with light, but I wanted to show more in terms of like form contrast. It's a little bit harping on shape contrast here, right? But essentially, all these forms out here in the grays, they are very much kind of this like blocky, angular form. They're very square in a way. Like, sure, these ones are in diagonals, but they're still very square. And the forms over here are also very edgy, but they're also curved and sleek and more like a blade, like a saber. And they have a different quality, you know. It could also be a big round thing, but it's different enough where this thing feels interesting just because the shape and the form itself is different than the form out here, you know. And they're close in a way, but there's enough difference relative to everything else that it starts feeling unique and different, just from the way that the form is designed, you know. Or that's one of the ways that the stuff is being contrasted, right? So you can use form here to contrast. Everything else here kind of harmonizes in terms of form language, but this thing contrasts in terms of form language. So that's kind of that's the whole idea. I think you're starting to get the sense for what's going on with these like basic principles. You can use these different things to contrast. Number 4 here is space. So space is kind of interesting. It's also one of the ones that I think most people have a hard time understanding and also utilizing. Space is basically the contrast and the composition of the space itself, you know. Having you see this image here, and then you have this space and it's just empty, and then there's a circle and then just one guy right there, and the space kind of feels dynamic and a little bit off center. It feels different than this somehow feels a little bit more balanced. This really feels like we're falling out of the image, and maybe that's the feeling you're going for, and that's just through the awkwardness of the space, right? And here we're more in the center, and it feels a little bit more balanced in a way. It doesn't feel as awkward, and if it was dead in the middle, this image would feel very balanced. The space wouldn't feel as awkward. It would feel like, okay, there's kind of a meaning here. He is definitely pushing what feels natural in the space, you know. So it's in a way, space, you can think about it as composing the space. You could almost do like look from above and then see how are things placed, but in 3 dimensions. Like you're placing things interestingly in the space here. You can see here we got all these like this mass here gathered around the corners here, but then we got this like open area with like lots of people, and it creates interest in the image just because we got that contrast between how the space is utilized, which I find very fascinating. And another thing that space can help with is proportions. If you're not careful with your space and the way you're organizing your elements in your space, you can get these things where suddenly stuff feels very big. Obviously, these plates are actually very big, but it happens sometimes when people scale their things incorrectly because they're not considering the space, and then stuff gets misaligned, right? Where this is actually what they're supposed to feel like. I think you get that point, but it's something to consider. It's like how the space and how you place stuff in the space can mess with your sense of proportions. In many ways, composed space is an opportunity to think like an interior designer or an architect. I think composed space is probably one of the things that they think the most about, and I think as artists for the entertainment industry, often we end up just thinking very flat. We make an image, and then we just try to make that image look good, because that's usually how the audience experiences stuff. Maybe not so much in games. There you definitely have 3D environments and stuff, and you kind of can't just think about it as a flat image. You kind of have to think about it as a composed space. But I'll tell you, lots of design for games or something, or for film, are done with, here's a piece of concept art, and the concept art is just a 2D image, that is flat, and then the space hasn't really been considered because it's not the easiest thing to actually figure out inside of it. Versus if you were an architect, then that's kind of your bread and butter. That's like everything you do is thinking about how things relate to each other and feel in the space. And they're not as concerned as like what something looks like from a certain angle, because it kind of has to work from every angle. And I think they have a much more natural way of working with composed space. And I think there's certain kinds of design you just don't get if you don't consider how the space can be dynamic. Like on this thing, it's really interesting. We've got this tall thing just in the space, and then this thin, narrow thing. It gives a certain feeling. And I wouldn't say it's the contrast of everything here. It's the fact that there is something very tall and then something narrow, and then all this emptiness of space. And it's very interesting in that sense. It makes us feel like we're high up and we could fall down or something. So thinking about how space relates, etc. And then I want to show another example here from my own work and how I'm using space. In terms of form, these forms here are kind of similar in quality to a lot of the stuff. It's not really out there, but I think space-wise, there's something interesting going on with like all this clutter. All this clutter of like, and then this emptiness out here. So there's two different spaces, and that makes this space here feel really interesting. And then just from the amount of space that this thing is taking up makes that interesting. It's not because this is a different cool color or something like we looked at before. We kind of looked at like a bigger version of this red building essentially. And there was kind of some other stuff going on. But in terms of space, I think it's taking up space essentially, and it's becoming interesting because of that, And there's a sense of composed space in this area where like it's like if you walk around here, it's not the same when you walk around here. There's different kinds of spaces. Here it's very cluttered. Here it's very open, and here it's very kind of overwhelming in a way, with the way the space is there. Okay. Next one is value. I'm just going to take 1 second here to look at some comments just to see if I missed anything. I will probably miss some things just because I am, focusing a lot here. But let's see here. Lots of people writing here. Great. There's going to be a break halfway through, so probably in half an hour or something, there's going to be a break, and then like a 5-minute break, and then we'll continue to the next part. And this will probably be on YouTube afterwards. It will be on YouTube, so when the live stream is done, then it will be available for replay, etc. Reminds me of those mind benders where your brain automatically completes random lines into letters and numbers. I love the use of negative space when designing topography. The idea of empty space actually have power to an eye is so cool. Yes, empty space is an interesting thing. I think with things like empty space and space, and there's many different ways of looking at it, I've come to the conclusion that I just work with shapes, you know. So shapes, it doesn't matter if it's a white shape or a dark shape. I think negative space doesn't, it stopped making as much sense to me. It totally works, but in here there's negative space because we don't feel like there's anything there, where these blocks are filling the screen out with form and space. It's filling out the space. But if we really look at it, it's just a shape that is white, and this shape is also a shape that is bright, and then a shape that is dark, essentially, right? So it's just shapes, and I think on that level, that's kind of where they work, and I think it just simplifies how you think about it. You don't have to identify something as negative space or not, but at the end of the day, whatever works for you, that's kind of the point here. Okay, so we're gonna look at value, and I just want to prefix on saying, like, this is far too short of a lecture for me to teach you, like, and about how, what is good values and what is good colors and what is good lines and all those things, and what to do in the right place, etc. I'm just highlighting the different aspects of these design things, and building a foundation to hopefully build upon. Okay, value. Value is kind of, it's an interesting part of, like, of our world, because we're kind of going from dark to bright, and that helps us do all kinds of things, like depicting form, handling shapes, showing depth. There's many things that values is kind of used for. I think one of the interesting things with value that to consider is transitions in your values, right? Like here we have very harsh transitions between our values white and dark, right? Where here we have like a mix of things, where here there's a very soft transition. You know, it's like, it's just a blur. You know, it's a soft transition. Where here the transition is very hard, and here the transition is very hard. That means we pay attention to these things in a certain way. But I would actually say that the way that this bridge is here, that definitely feels like the focal, because it's very soft right here, and then it gets very sharp with some of these things, and that contrast and play makes this area interesting, because everything else is kind of sharp here. Even though they're very clear in terms of forms, the contrast of transition is happening like right here, and that's what I think makes the image interesting, is that it's this bridge going into the fog, you know. So even though everything else is more readable, quote unquote, then the interest and play is happening right here, even though maybe it's more subtle and soft, but that's where the dynamicness is. So just, I think transitions are quite interesting, and obviously here the transition is very clear, like this is where we're looking, you know, it's like black on white, etc. Something else you can consider in your values is range. You know, you can create an image with just a very limited range, you know, like the white over here is basically halfway to black, you know, so it's not white like this white here, but it feels right, and that's because it's a different range. It's a dark room and stuff like this, and we know this is still white, even though it's actually gray if you color picked it, you know. You could make an image that's very dark, and then that'll feel a certain way versus like something that's very light, etc. You can also limit kind of your kind of your transition zone, so like the amount of values you have in your range. So you just have something like, okay, in the grays I just have one value, and then here I have another value, and then I have another value. You essentially just have, you know, 4 or 5 values to play with here, you know, and that gives it a certain look and a certain impact, whatever. Also very useful when blocking things out or building things out, to think in simpler terms before moving on to complexer things. You can also have difference in how much range of value was used, you know. So kind of like when we looked at with line, there's this difference in line quality. Here's a difference in value range, basically. So around the head we have basically the full range from bright white to dark black. In the shirt we have one value, just white, you know, and it makes this feel different and contrasty, and it makes it interesting and have that play, because there's a contrast in the range. Yeah, I'm gonna use my own example here. It's like all these things are more or less the same, but then here there's like a little bit of play, and you got like a nice contrasty bit right there, and that means that this becomes the focal because of the value contrast right there, that becomes the focal of the image. This should be pretty evident to hopefully most of you who've tried designing things first. It's like if you want contrast, or if you want people to look a certain place in your image, if you want your image to have a focal point, then value is definitely the strongest and simplest way of creating focal and attention. It's not the only way, but it's one of the ways, and it's definitely the strongest way. And I think the reason for that is that when humans grew, or like humans evolved, or let's say animals evolved, and the first eyes that were developed were basically just simple black and white things. You could see darkness, you could see brightness, and then that evolved, and I think it's the most primal, most basic way of discerning shapes in nature, which makes sense. Color, the sixth principle here, or the sixth element. Color is color, like I think you guys hopefully all know color, and color is also one of those things that are pretty good and strong for creating visual interest. Maybe some of you guys have heard of this thing called color theory, where you essentially have different kinds of color, complementary colors, primary colors, secondary colors, tertiary colors, all those things, and it's also a way of creating visual interest and contrast. Green and orange, or greenish and reddish, or actually what's it called, green and red, are kind of natural color complementaries, or natural color contrast, sorry. They're naturally contrasting with each other, and that means that if you have a red guy here and you got a bunch of green, then the red guy will seem really interesting because it naturally contrasts to green. I also specifically happen to really like red and green as a color contrast because lots of people are afraid of using it, but then in the recent years everyone's using it now, so that's nice, but everyone's using it in this way, just red cape and green fields. I guess it's very easy, and I think for a long time people were afraid of using it because I guess it was too Christmassy or something like that, but you can use complementary colors and contrast colors, etc., to create visual interest in your image in that sense. A different way of thinking about color is temperature. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, also why you might not want to do that, but essentially you have things that are warm and cold, and you can see that shadows in daylight typically appear cold because the shadows are being lit up by the sky, the blue sky, so you have cold shadows and you have kind of a warm highlight, and you can think of your colors in that sense, that you have a difference between something that's cold and something that's warm. And you can use that as a principle to say, okay, maybe we want to boost the warmth a little bit, or boost the coldness, or this feels cold. What is it missing? Maybe it's missing a little bit of warmth, and then you can look into some of the warmer colors or something like that. Another aspect that's really important about color that lots of people forget and really underutilize is saturation. Instead of just having, teal and orange, or red and green, like a strong color contrast, you can also have a contrast of saturation, right? I think this image is really, really interesting for the one reason that the environment is very, very saturated, filled with color, filled with this red color. And on the focal point, this little white thing here, it's just a desaturated white little, rover, or truck, or moon car, or whatever the hell it is. And this image is interesting just because it has saturation contrast in it. Like, I think if this was black and white, it wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting. I think it's interesting because of that contrast of saturation, not necessarily because it's not a green and a red thing. It's not a color contrast. It's the contrast of saturation that makes it really interesting. And sure, value and all these other things plays a role, but the reason why the image is interesting is because of this saturation contrast, which is very nice. And I want to use an example here. So I have a lot of kind of desaturation happening out here, and this thing here is basically just like grays and whites, and then I got all these green fields that are a bit more saturated, and there's a natural contrast between those things, and that makes it kind of a little bit interesting. Then I'm also sneaking a little bit of a red and green color contrast here to just create a little bit of secondary play and interest, and they kind of feel harmonious and nice together, and that's very lovely. So yeah, it's just an example of using color to create to create an image. Okay, the seventh one is texture, and texture is kind of interesting because it's you can think about it in many different ways. And I think I always kind of shift on like how I think about them. But essentially, this is just thousands and thousands of tires. But when seen like this, they stop becoming tires and start becoming a texture. Essentially, it's just a texture, and the way they contrast to the sand or the beach or the desert thing here is very apparent, right? There's an interest of play going on right there that makes this image interesting. There's one texture and another texture, and they're fighting each other for attention. And the same thing over here, like the texture and the quality of the rock is very apparent versus the quality of this palette. Like it's almost like it's asking us to pay attention to the pristineness and the purest white of this palette. If this rock was a little bit less textural, just a little bit more subdued and not as like vibrant and contrasty, I don't think this would feel as pristine as it's doing right now. And I think that's one of the powerful things to think about with texture and like contrasting texture, that you can use it as a way to make something feel a certain way. I often think about texture, you can kind of break it down as like surface. Here you got some bits that are kind of smooth, and you got some bits that are rough and gnarly, and then there's a play and contrast between those things. And over here we kind of got this sky, we got this metal thing, and then we got the surface here that is this texture. I would say this is purely interesting from a point of view of like texture, maybe also color. But if this was just a red color but the same texture as this, I don't think it would be nearly as interesting. I think the texture is what makes it feel saucy and interesting as an image to see, etc. Worth photographing and depicting, if that makes sense. Sometimes I think about texture in terms of just complexity. Like it's just how I think about it, and sometimes that it just really works for me. And I think with all of these things, it's just ways of like looking at it that helps you make interesting design decisions. That's the bottom line. I'm gonna say that multiple times, so sorry for repeating myself. Like this thing, for example, it's we have all these kind of this fish lined up here, and then there's all this kind of complexity and scatterability, and then there's just this like simplicity of this this human here and this bear thing here, and it makes that area just interesting and makes the image kind of come together. And I kind of wanted to actually modify this image, but I didn't have the exact amount of time. But this is quite interesting just as a texture. I think as an image, it's very like, it doesn't really matter where you look, But what you could do, for example, if we made one car over here into a pristine car, like just a fixed car, a car that was just in mint condition, it would suddenly become really interesting because it would now contrast to everything else that was broken, and that means that there's kind of like a contrast in complexity, and I would kind of call that not texture, but it's just a different way of thinking about it, and it helps me, so maybe it helps you to think about it like that. And you wouldn't have to do that, but if you wanted me to look in a certain direction or a certain place of the image, then you could do that. This more has like a broad sphere of influence. And I think it was actually kind of interesting. So this is my own work and just a way of showing you how to use texture. So here I'm trying to make texture kind of the focal. I have this huge sea monster here that's like kind of washed up on the beach. And the goal was actually to make the sea monster blend with the environment. The typical thing is you have a big sea monster, you want to show it, be like, oh, look how cool this thing is. But I actually wanted this to be the main thing. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure that this feels like this stuff. And I'm using a lot of texture, like the wetness and the shininess here, and trying to match that here, and also color. Lots of things to try to make it kind of blend with this stuff. And there's rocks and things, but everything is just quite close, so you don't pay too much attention. And then there's this very different kind of fish organic chaos of texture, essentially, and that's that's what kind of creates that interest, I think, and intrigue is whatever's going on here. And maybe it's contrast or complexity, texture. For me, usually they end up becoming the same thing in the way I think about them or in the way that I design them, and that's kind of the bottom line there. Once again, the exact breakdown and classification of each of these elements is not what is important. What is important is your ability to use it creatively. Use it usually in the form of creating contrast and harmony, right? So sometimes you have a lot of contrast, sometimes you have a harmony with the things. All these things should feel somewhat harmonious. These things are contrasting, and that's when images become interesting, if you ask me. Okay, just gonna take a little breather here and just look at some of the comments here. What do we hear? Glad that you're offering this for free. Well, my pleasure. It's also very much, I think, for me to be able to understand this better. I think a really good way of learning things is to explain things to other people, and I've spent a long time kind of explaining this to other people. So that's pretty exciting. Shape language regarding spaceships is so prominent in Star Wars because you can read a fighting scene so easily without focusing too much. That's probably true. Yes, silhouette's important. Reminds me of those Mindbender. Right, I've been through these comments already. Will this be up on the channel after? Yeah. Cool. Okay. I hope that that everyone is taking notes. Actually, I guess nobody's taking notes because the video is just available, so you can just watch it at your own leisure. But if you do have questions about some of the stuff, then please feel free to comment and write in the chat. I will be watching it on the side. And also, now we're kind of going through all the fundamentals, and that's what's going to make the second part make sense, hopefully, because that's where we start getting into some of the complexities, and where stuff hopefully gets a little bit more interesting. And for me personally, where all the new stuff is coming. But we just need to establish this foundation to get everyone on the same page. Yeah, it's awesome what you're doing. This is for free. I don't know a lot about art, but it's very interesting. Well, that's cool. Okay, physical elements. Now we're kind of moving into the territory of stuff that I guess people know about this stuff and we discuss it, but we don't really put words to it, and that's okay. I just want to highlight some things that maybe you can think about when you're designing things. So physical elements, as opposed to the abstract elements, the physical elements is what we use from the physical real world to guide and assist our design. So all the other things we looked at, they're just kind of like visual abstract principles like shape and form and color and value. And yes, those things exist in the real world, but we're not really thinking about them in terms of like, oh yeah, there's this, you can go find the principle of color in nature. Like, no, you can observe color in nature, but as an abstract concept, it's kind of this thing that we invented as humans. Like, we defined what colors are, we defined what value is. They exist in nature, but then, etc. These things are a bit more like things we kind of directly pull from the real world and help guide our design. One of the things that I think are really interesting to just kind of try to focus on and play with is material, right? Material is a markup of a whole bunch of different kind of abstract elements. Like there's color, there's texture, there's value, form probably sometimes, like all these things that that a material is made up of, right? But we think of materials in a different way than we think of color. Materials are cool because they come with certain associations, and there's different types of materials. And I think the big thing with materials is like generally there are these things called dielectrics, which are non-metals, and then you have metals. And that's kind of the big grouping of materials. There's also some other materials that are somewhere in between. But basically, materials behave differently depending on the kind of material it is. Dielectrics, they kind of just reflect light. Metals, they reflect light and tint the light that they reflect. And that's why metals feel the way that metals feel. That's why this feels metallic, is because it reflects light and then it tints everything slightly yellowy or orangey or golden. And that's why you see inside of this cup here, the way it reflects the light, it keeps getting bounced, and then tints the light, and that makes it more and more its natural color, if you could say that. That's basically what's going on with metals, where dielectrics, they kind of absorb a lot of the light, and then they reflect orange, and then they also reflect kind of like the sheath of like just the natural light that's coming in, and then they feel different, etc. It's just we're not going to go into details. It's just know about those classifications. I think one thing that's really cool with materials is kind of the symbolic value that they hold. Gold, for instance, you know, when you hear gold or when you think about gold, you have all these associations that come along with it, like being rich or being wealthy or it being precious or all those things, or being valuable, you know, all those things. Like gold, just when you put gold on something, we feel a certain way about the things. And that's not because it's yellow, or it's because it's shiny, or because it's maybe a little bit to do with shiny, or because it has a certain value or a certain form. It's just because it's gold. It almost doesn't matter which form the gold has. The fact that it's gold is going to make us feel a certain way, you know. And this is obvious to all of you, but you can use that to your advantage to imply certain things. You know, if you have something that is metal, it's going to feel strong, you know. It's going to feel strong just because it's made of metal or steel specifically, right? Then it's going to be, oh, this feels strong. This feels tough, you know. And so if you're designing a tough thing, then metal, you can just use the material quality to do a certain thing. This was something with you know, like a white material, like something that's very bright. I think it's easier, or it's harder to keep that clean. So if you're able to keep it clean, that probably means you're maybe rich or well off or something like that, because you either have people to wash it or you can always wash it. Versus if it's dirty, right? Then it would just get dirty. I think there's this thing of like white can also be seen as like an expensive, exclusive material. There's more to do with like color, whatever, but it's kind of the same quality or whatever. But I think materials is a really interesting thing, so just think about materials as their own thing. And we'll get into this more later on, but I just wanted to establish it already here. Yeah, just some work of my own here where I'm using material contrast to create interest. So here we have all this kind of stone work, basically like concrete work, and then there's a very stark material difference between this like red shiny metallic thing and then the concrete thing here, and it makes these things fight for attention, which is exactly what I want you to do. Like as a user, as a viewer, I want you guys to fight these things, to fight for attention. Like this is grabbing a lot of the attention, but then this deck has some other things going for it, and it makes it have this duality over here, but it makes it interesting, and that's what I'm going for here, because contrast is created. And the same thing is going on here. I got this little guy sitting up here in this like robotic armor, and he's very organic. He's an organic little thing, and he feels very kind of almost fragile and vulnerable, especially next to kind of the toughness and the harshness of this like metallic exterior. And the contrast at play here makes that interesting. That's kind of what I'm trying to highlight, is that these things are competing for attention. They're trying, like all of this is harmonious, but then there's something right here that's just very different than this, and it creates visual interest and play. And also I just happen to really like gray and red. I don't know, so that's a red thread in all my work, I guess. So that's material, you know, thinking about how you can contrast those things to each other and create interest, and think about the value they have, and the fact that organicness maybe feels fragile, the toughness feels tough, etc. Second one here is framing. Framing is a little bit bizarre, but it's just something to also think about. You know, whenever you're making something, you have some kind of framing in mind. You know, maybe you're showing your thing in a cinema, maybe you're showing your thing in a comic book, maybe you're showing it a VR headset, maybe you're showing it on a phone. You know, and depending on the framing, you are going to think differently about how you present something, or which aspects are important to consider. I think often with framing, we always have some kind of camera or like a POV. some kind of looking glass, some kind of way we're experiencing the thing, and it's all based on, it's all grounded in our human perception, and then we're transforming the feelings in such a way. If you're in the cinema or something like that, you can have a shot where somebody is very close, like a big medium shot of somebody, like kind of like here, we're very close to the person, and that's maybe gonna make the whole scene feel more intense, just because we know what it's like being close to a person, and then that feeling feels intense, versus being far away, then we kind of have distance, we feel maybe in control or something like that, right? It's all based on human perception. And depending on if you're using, for example, if you're using a camera or something like that for your scene, then things will feel a certain way. Maybe you're working within a flat context, everything is just flat, and then different rules apply. There's no depth, there's no perspective, there's no anything like that, and then you have to organize things in a different way. These things still have, a camera has like a frame, a two-dimensional frame that everything is seen through, and this has a two-dimensional frame that everything is seen through. Sculptures don't, like a sculpture inherently exists in a three-dimensional space, and that means that you typically don't really think about them in terms of like a two-dimensional composition. It can happen, of course, with certain sculptures, but the idea is that they have interest throughout. So that means that many times with sculptures, you're thinking much more about kind of the composed space and the form. How are we creating interest within the full volume of this sculpture? There's something up here that's interesting. There's something down here that's interesting. There's something interesting in front. There's something interesting in the back. I think there's this common saying that like your sculpture should look good from every angle, and that can obviously be difficult. And I don't think it's necessarily true, but it is something to consider. Also, if you have a set, what's the point of view you have? It's a very dynamic way of looking around, and this very much like relates to the whole architecture thing, etc. That depending on your frame of reference, you might design things in a certain way, and you can kind of see that here, that like framing will often lead to composition, and in this sense, you will have a very very literal interpretation of composition, like the image is composed. But the way I designed this is that this was one big environment that kind of had to work from many different angles, and then that becomes kind of tricky, because if I just had 17 cameras and I tried to move everything so everything aligned, that would quickly get difficult. Instead, what's happening is that I'm thinking like an architect, and then I'm trying to compose the entire space just from the point of view of an architect, and then afterwards I'm photographing it like a photographer. So I'm kind of using two different frame references. Like when I'm designing the space as an architect, then my framing is basically a person walking around in the environment, and I'm thinking like a person walking around the environment, and like, okay, they're gonna see it from everywhere, so it kind of has to be interesting from everywhere. When I then start making actual shots, then I'm thinking about it as though in the context of a cinematographer for a film or something, then there's the 2D shot that matters, and the contrast here and the lighting there, etc., and like how this reads, right, versus the overall space. In terms of contrast, there's many different kinds of contrast going on here, but you can contrast your framing, right? So you might see this in film, right? But let's say we have a shot like this, and then we have a shot like this. There's a contrast in how these things are framed. This thing is kind of diagonally and kind of a little bit more dynamic. This thing is very stable and kind of grandiose in a different way. And then when this shot is played first, then you're kind of gonna feel a certain way, and then this shot is played afterwards, that's gonna feel another way, And then here we're also very open and seeing things from far away, and then we're going down to this shot, and then now we're closer and things are a little more intense and near. And the contrast between those two framings creates interest and etc. And you can also think, and if you're a cinematographer, you have to think this way. You have to think about the dynamicness between your shots. There's a lot of stuff going on here. I'm just trying to highlight. Think about what elements you can pick apart and then contrast with each other. That's the whole point of this stuff. Going from this shot to this shot is way less dynamic and way less contrasty than going from this shot to this shot. There's way more contrast happening in the shot to shot, etc. But these things are more harmonious. So if you don't need something like really big and striking to happen, then maybe it's within this space you need to roll the same things with these things here, right? More harmonious, big contrast between these things, right? So this is more about contrasting your frames, etc. Okay, we're almost nearing a break. We just have a few more things to go through, then we'll get to a break. Another thing to think about is lighting, but think about lighting as like a physical aspect of the world. Do you have neon lights? Do you have a sun and clouds? Do you have lots of lights cast from the top? I think something really cool about lighting is that it's often the thing that kind of like defines the mood of something. I think lighting and the human perception, they're just kind of bound together, and you can use that to your advantage. Like a bright day on the beach feels nice and calm and maybe exciting. Lots of LED lights or whatever with a hefty fiery thing doesn't feel as calming. It feels a bit more intimidating and kind of dystopian. Lighting really shapes the mood of how we perceive things, more than anything, I would say. And obviously it's a product of value, but I think lighting just inherently really affects us emotionally. And the same thing with atmosphere. If you have something very foggy, then this kind of feels not dead, but kind of there's like a the best way to like a sheet on the thing. Everything is down and heavy and maybe a little bit depressing or like bleak or something like that, right? Like lighting is really interesting, and I like categorizing atmosphere as a part of lighting. I'll get to that in a little bit, but some things to think about with lighting is kind of what type of lighting do you have? Do you have a directional light, a sun that's beaming through and that's going to behave a certain way? Do you have a neon light? Do you have just like artificial lights that are lighting up everything, or do you have just kind of like ambient lighting? Here everything is kind of gray. There's no real sense of the sun. It's just being lit up by the great sky. And I think the important thing about thinking about lighting instead of just thinking about value or color is that lighting is very practical if you're, for example, shooting for film. And if you designed all your lights with just shape and color, then maybe it would be possibly impossible to recreate. Thinking about lighting as part of your scenes and sets can go a really long way, and also help ground it in the way we perceive the stuff as humans. And the same goes for atmosphere. Atmosphere is really, really cool because it's kind of these particles in the air that help diffuse the light. And atmosphere has many abilities. One of the things is it's usually the main feeling of depth in something. Like when you have the atmosphere kind of filling up the environment, then you're going to get these transitions of values, and that's a product of the atmosphere. And it's very useful in that sense to use atmosphere as well. And you can also get this like diffusion of the light, with atmosphere. If you wanted something to feel softer and not as harsh and also obscured, then atmosphere is really interesting in that sense. And I think you can contrast lighting by itself, which I think is really interesting. Is that here I have different kinds of light sources that fundamentally work in a really, really different way, and it makes them contrast. So we have this kind of like rigid structured light, and it's contrasting this like hologram light. There's very different kinds of light, but there's almost an interest in the way that the light, the quality of the light. It's not like, sure, there's like some value stuff going on here, but I think the fact that there's these different kinds of lights happening, and then all these like people, here, all these smaller people holding, iPhones or candles, whatever, is contrasting the type of light going on here. So there's a little bit of play within that, etc. Which is I thought it was an interesting way of using light for contrast. And I think 10 more minutes, then we'll take a break. Function is just something you can think about. It's like the way for me function is just like taking certain functionality from the world and then using it in your design. It could be from nature, it could be from kind of mechanical stuff, or like anatomy or something like that. Nature is interesting in that if you want to design an environment, then maybe knowing about for example erosion. There's water runs through mountains, and then they carve out these paths in the mountain, and it makes them look a certain way. If you don't have that in your work, that kind of detail, your work can look less accurate. If versus just doing a mountain shape, you're like, yeah, this looks like a mountain, but it doesn't really look like a mountain. Understanding those natural principles can help guide your visual design in a certain way. Same thing that like green stuff grows around water. Just knowing that means that you can design that interest in that way, and we all know it when we see it, but if we don't think about it, we might not implement it. And the same thing with in the redwood forests, you can have lots of areas where there isn't grass growing because the top of the forest is so covered by the canopies of the trees that not a lot of light gets through. So just not a lot of grass would grow next to those things. These are the kinds of like information about nature you would have to know to make smart, good design decisions, because we feel them instinctively when we see them. We're like, right, something doesn't feel right. But if you know them and understand them, then you can implement them. Same thing with anatomy. Understanding human anatomy will probably make you a better artist in terms of drawing people, but and that's its own discipline. And also understanding that some anatomies can seem very similar or look similar, but work in really different ways. The falcon is definitely very aerodynamic. That's a property of its anatomy. And the penguin is also aerodynamic, but they're just aerodynamic in two different mediums, the sky and in the water. Similar principles, but different anatomies and different use cases. It's just understanding these things means that if you want to design a creature and you want to make it a water creature, look at the way that water creatures are aerodynamic, etc., etc., etc. And if you want to make a winged creature, then look at the way that winged creatures are aerodynamic. Use these principles to inform your design, or you don't have to, but it's a way of designing that's pretty helpful. Same thing goes with mechanisms. I always think about this from designing a building. I look at the way buildings are constructed, how are the materials held together to try to create that realism or sensibility. And you can still stylize stuff, but if it's grounded in something in realism, you're gonna reutilize some elements. If you're making a robot arm, think about the axes and where stuff can turn and power sources and the amount of axes here and stuff to turn. Like it helps create believability. You don't have to do these things. It's just a way of thinking about the design. And there's a different way of like stuff being aerodynamic. A Formula 1 car is fast, but it doesn't have that like the kind of the same sleek nature as like the Falcon. It's a little bit more weird, and that's because it's built to be fast in a very specific way. It's a lot about downforce. So you have all these big wings here, and all they do is push the vehicle down to the ground to make it really stick to the ground, so they get traction with the tires. So it's still fast, but it's obtaining speed in a different way than just being aerodynamic. It's more about creating downforce and traction. And that's, if you know about those things, you can replicate them in your design and use those things to inform your visual design, etc. And just a way of creating contrast here. So here I'm using my understanding of animal anatomy to create this dinosaur. That should be obvious, but you could also contrast the function by you have this ancient creature in a modern society, there's like a natural, interesting contrast there in terms of like the functionality, if that makes sense. You have something very old and organic; it doesn't belong in this world, and then something modern, etc. So you could probably contrast. You could also have, somebody walking around with a modern cell phone in the medieval times. There would probably be a natural contrast of the functions, or like of mechanics or whatever, and that kind of way. Think about contrasts. That's the point here. Abstraction is the final thing that we're going to take a break. Abstraction basically is the ability to abstract something. Everything in the real world is in some way abstracted by humans. We abstract it when we create art. We create an abstraction of that thing, and there's different ways of abstracting things. Like there's some kind of realistic thing underneath, but then there's this abstract version made of it. A simple line drawing, which is we're abstracting it. This is clearly a person, but all the things typically associated with a person, eyes, wrinkles, all those things, they're not really there, but we still recognize it as a person. There's an abstraction. These are sheep, even though they're just telephones with wires, but we still know that they're sheep. These have been abstracted in a certain way. I think about abstraction in two ways. One way is simplifying. You have something complex in society, like a rib cage and a pelvis and femurs. They don't look like this, but we can abstract them in this way, and that makes them helpful for us to understand in terms of drawing and building them up as forms. It could also be that simplification is the final product. Here we have a sculpture of a car, and we know that this is a car, even though it's missing all the bits of the car, but it's maintaining the form and stuff. It's been abstracted. Very early on in the cave paintings, these are not realistic depictions, but they're still definitely horses and things. We recognize the abstractions. Humans are really good at this. It's one of the natural things we do. We're actually way better at abstracting things than drawing them realistically. Drawing them realistically is a lot harder. And these things are people. Like here, like there, body and arm. Two arms kind of holding up, looking at hands and feet, etc. So simplifying the reality. And the other way I look at it is kind of symbolizing, like abstraction symbolizing. Let's say you wanted to depict hypnosis or something like this. There's lots of different ways of depicting hypnosis. You could use spirally things to depict hypnosis. You can use kind of the feeling, the kind of the classic setup with a hypnotist, etc. And you can kind of use this like watch, etc. And so you have all these things you can use to symbolize hypnosis, because hypnosis is not really this visual thing you can just abstract. We have things associated with hypnosis. But let's say you had this phenomenon of like waving a clock back and forth or watch back and forth, and you wanted to hint at that but not literally show the clock. Well, you could just put a cucumber on a string and then maybe wiggle that back and forth, and that would be like, oh, this kind of feels like hypnosis, but you don't have any of the actual elements we associate with hypnosis. You just have this like abstraction of this, and it's not a simplification of this. It's just you're taking a quality and showing it in a different way, And in many ways, you could say that it's similar to simplifying. I just think about it like, okay, I'm taking a quality here and then reinterpreting the quality versus simplifying something. And maybe they're the same thing. Maybe they're just different words, etc. But it helps me thinking about it in this way. And just in terms of contrast here, with this abstraction, it gets a little bit more difficult. But I have this spaceship here, which I call the scarab. And when you hear that it's called the scarab, then you're like, right, okay, I can kind of see why it would be called the scarab. If you know the scarab, it's this like beetle-like thing with the prongs on its head, and it kind of has a little bit of that shape and rest line. So there's a little bit of the simplification going on here for scarab, but then reappropriated in a different way. There's a level of abstraction or symbolism going on there. This thing is called headache, and it should be pretty self-explanatory. So I'm taking the concept of headache and actually making it more complex or symbolizing the stuff in a way. It's all this is a little bit harder to explain, but just a way of thinking about your design, etc. Cool. The overall point and message is, if you can find some quality a quality, element, dimension, or other that you can use as a source to create harmony or contrast, you can create something of interest to the viewer. So all these elements we just listed now, they're just different ways of contrasting things or think about harmony or those kind of things. You can think about all those separate things, be like, okay, I'm going to attack anatomy, or I'm going to attack line, or I'm going to attack shape or form, or compose space or color, etc. Think about those things and then contrast them with each other. Okay, we're going to take a short break. That went on for a while. When we come back, we're going to actually start talking about the whole point of this this lecture. Now we're just all on the same page, hopefully, so there's a lot of information there. So I'll be back in 5 minutes. And we are back to the stream here. Just getting it set back up. Hope that everyone's comfortable and everyone's doing well. So this part of the stream now is actually what it's all about. So that whole first part was just kind of a necessary first step and layer of foundation for everyone to kind of understand what was going on. And the thing we're going to move into now is the stuff that I'm actually excited about. And it's kind of some things that I've been thinking about for a while, and it's a way of thinking about design and making better design decisions, essentially. So hopefully there'll be something new and a different way of thinking about stuff that that's going to be useful to everyone. So let's move into that. Okay. Part 2. The complexities of visual design. This is something that I recently taught some students at my old university. So just in the past 2 weeks, I've been at my old university teaching basically concept art, and we had this lecture on basically this stuff here, and it was very interesting, and I think that people there were really enjoying the content. So I hope that you guys will also see what it is. I am trying to basically put words to a lot of stuff that's happening automatically for people out there in the industry. They're designing things and they're doing all these complex ways of designing, but it's very hard to put words on what's actually happening, and that's the goal of this. So let's move into this here now. Let's see what we get. So we're gonna go through 3 different things, and the first thing is something I call contrast variety. The second thing is called contrast distribution, and the third thing is called design resonance. And hopefully they increase in interest. I definitely think the last thing here, design resonance, this is kind of like key thing that I think is really, really interesting. And it's just a term I came up with. It's not, there's no names for these things. It's just what I call them. The other things we talked about in the first part, that's much more common to talk about the things in that way. This is definitely, nobody else is talking about it like this. I'm talking about it like this, or at least to my knowledge. A lot of the things that I'm discussing, people are doing and utilizing. We're just not really putting words to it. So that's the whole point right here. Okay, contrast variety. So when creating contrast, most people out there, myself included, will use stuff like value, light, and shape to create contrast. But it's not really the only sense of source of contrast. It's definitely one of the more powerful ones, but it's not the only source. And I think we just looked at that before, and the whole fundamentals, that should be very evident to you now, that there's all different kinds of ways of creating contrast and interest in an image. But I just want to highlight some things specifically. So reiterating, we have shape contrast, we have color contrast, we have like maybe scale contrast. You have a small elephant and big elephants, and yeah, there's a shape contrast, but there's also just the fact that it's a small elephant and a big elephant. And then you have stuff like material contrast. And material contrast is really interesting, I think. We already talked about it a little bit, but I think material contrast is really interesting. So Darth Vader and Darth Sidious, if you think about them in terms of silhouettes, they are not actually that different. Yeah, sure, Darth Vader is a little bit taller and he has a helmet, but they're also kind of just these like big black blobs in a way, right? Like Darth Vader could also look like Yoda, and then he would contrast a lot to Darth Sidious in terms of like shape and size and all those things, and color, etc. But they're actually really similar in terms of like shape, and then in color they're also really similar. They're just all dressed in black. And the smart thing about these things is that they feel like they're part of the same faction. They have an association with each other. They're both dressed in black. They feel like the bad guys, etc. So in order to create variation and contrast between them, they opted instead for using a lot of material contrast. Right? Darth Sidious is very kind of soft and cloaked and cloth-like. Darth Vader is like this sleek, almost mechanical, robotic thing, and it makes him feel like the machine man, and him feel like the old ancient cloth man, you know. And it's a really interesting way of creating contrast. And the same way in Darth Sidious, he has this like slight sliver of organicness. It's like a ghostly organicness. It's deadly, but it's still more human than whatever Darth Vader has going on. He's definitely the machine man and kind of detached from reality. Material contrast is really cool in that way. It's like everything in here is just dark and black, but it feels very, very different, etc. Material contrast is really interesting. Another thing is color contrast. We already talked about these things, and essentially you have your complementary colors, etc. Color contrasts, and when you actually break it down, then this is kind of what's going on the inside, right? You have your blues versus your oranges, etc., etc., etc. And a different way of looking at this stuff is kind of warm and cool, like temperature, etc. We already looked at this thing, but I will say that I think there is a certain danger to thinking about color in terms of warm and cool. It's a very useful tool, but it can also make you simplify the colors. Like essentially what it's doing is that like when people think warm and cool, they're like, oh, okay, this is a bit too, we should make sure to have warm and cool in our image. Then what they do is that they find the most cool thing and the most warm thing, and then they just contrast those two things, and they start forgetting all these other ones because they're trying to make sure to have warm and cool. So warm and cool is useful, but it can also just make you simplify way too much, and then you get this. You basically just have stuff that looks like it belongs together, but it has nothing to do with each other, and you're creating the same decisions. It's really bizarre, And that's kind of somebody out there went teal and orange, warm and cool. Let's just make everything with that, versus trying something different. So it can be a little bit dangerous to just use warm and cool versus thinking about the full spectrum here, etc., etc., etc. Still useful, just use it with care. The thing you want instead is kind of this stuff where you still have warm and cool, but there's variation within the warm. There's some color complementaries. There's different kinds of things at play. Just something to be wary of. Warm and cool is not always the full way to go. And then once again, personally, I'm just really into saturation contrast. I think it's underutilized. That's why I'm going to talk to everyone about it, is that I think saturation contrast is really, really cool. Once again, I'm going to use the same image here. The fact that it's saturated and desaturated just makes it really, really, really cool. Saturation contrast. Use it. It's awesome. Material contrast. We're going to go back to that. Star Wars is the king of material contrast, and it's so interesting. We have these the Jedi warriors, for example, right? And the Jedi warriors are basically just monks. Basically just monks. And then they just do this thing where just, let's have slightly shiny boots. It makes the boots so much more significant. And also it makes the cloth so much more significant, because now there's something that's different to the cloth, and you pay attention to the fact that like, oh, okay, this is different than this thing, because I can see the difference right here in front of my eyes. This is different than that stuff. And then it almost feels more soft and more rough and more cloth-like, because there's that contrast. And then the really cool with Jedi Knights, like the most kind of the iconic things about Jedi Knights is the lightsaber. And if you wanted to contrast a lightsaber with this stuff, then just have it be this like chrome shiny thing on top of this like rough cloth thing. And then the shiny lightsaber is going to stand out in comparison to the soft cloth Jedi Knight. Material contrast. We're contrasting materials, and that makes this feel really special, which is the whole point. Yoda, in terms of values and like and shapes and stuff, there's not that much going on, but there's a lot of stuff going on in terms of like materials, And I think the whole material contrast thing is also why so many people have a strong attachment to using puppets versus using VFX, because materials are so much more present in actual stuff. You can make them in CG also, but it just it's a lot harder to get that right. Getting this quality like this absolute perfection in terms of like detail and material quality, it's or I'd rather say imperfection. That's the hard thing, you know. I'd say that Yoda feels interesting because of the material qualities that are at play, and most famously, C-3PO and R2D2. It's the golden man and the white space can. You know, if this was, if he was just some rough robot or like some metal robot like dark or gray or whatever, it would just not have the same contrast going on. You know, and we would not remember it in the same way. It is the golden robot and the white space can. Like it's so simple and it's just like quality. And we're back to like the quality of gold feeling a certain way. Like he feels pristine and like expensive, and he's kind of like, oh, I'm your rugged little astro type who just does the dirty job, and C-3PO is more careful, you know. And I think there's something very important to think about in terms of how we design things. If you were designing everything with value and shape, you might not reach this conclusion of contrasting things with material. You just wouldn't, because you've been designing everything with value and shapes and be like, okay, these values read really well, and these shapes read really well, and then it reads. Like with this is a fundamentally different way. It's like you'd almost want to be like, you know what's interesting? A golden man, and then a white R2D2. I think these things could have looked shaped, like had different shapes, and still be equally as successful. But I think if they had different colors, or different materials rather, they would not have been. Because the image is so clear and strong, and what they represent is just defined by the materials that are at play. So yeah, material contrast I think is super essential and super interesting, and I think it's something that I wish more people would really dive into. I think what's happening a lot, or has happened a lot in newer films, is that stuff starts feeling kind of similar. Like these have different colors, all of these things, but the contrast in terms of material is really hard to kind of identify. Like to me, honestly, this here feels the same as this here. Like I can't actually tell you what kind of material this is. I guess it's some kind of cloth, but maybe this is also some kind of cloth. Like sure, maybe it's supposed to be metal, but it doesn't really feel like metal. And this here, is that the same as this, and this is the same as this. And even Iron Man, who is different, it's not even like that different. They're kind of like doing a pretty good job of making it also feel like this. And maybe they're like, oh, everything should feel really harmonious, but I think it just makes everything feel dull and not that different. And they're also kind of using similar shape-lined angles here and there, even though they're all from different places. And maybe they're doing that to make everything feel more cohesive, but I actually think it just makes everything feel more dull, and stuff feels less contrasty and less interesting, you know. So there's something missing here, and I think a big part of it is that is depending on who is kind of designing this and what kind of background they have. And the funny thing is that Marvel, and they're very much like one of the sinners of these things. Marvel, they used to, sometimes they get this right, and they're really good at it. This is Captain America from the first Captain America film. His suit looked like this here. This suddenly, with the way this stuff looks, I can tell you what this stuff is made of. I have a tangible feeling like, okay, right, this is this kind of like rugged military grade stuff, like padded stuff. I can see what that is, you know. And then it's really cool because we got that kind of stuff, and then it's just contrasted with just regular leather bags. You know, there's nothing crazy. Like this is not the same as this. You know, it's a different thing completely, and it contrasts really well, and it makes it work and look cool and have play and interest. You know, because there's so much contrast there. It's not all like the same. Versus like this. What the hell is this? You know, what are these bags here? There's zero contrast. With it's just everything is seamless, and it makes it less interesting and less. You know, you don't want to touch any of this stuff. You don't want to, you know, this has a tactile feeling, like, oh, a leather bag, oh, that feels interesting, and this material, I can kind of imagine what it'd be like to feel it. And I think that part is like really, really important, and because all these things are defined, you suddenly start noticing the shield as a significant thing, versus here it's like, yeah, I don't really know. It feels different. And even this thing is kind of doing what this thing is doing, but actually successfully. Here he's supposed to look goofy. I can tell you what this material is. It's sock material. It's ridiculous. And then he has these like leather gloves, and but it feels real and tangible. It's a very different way of like understanding stuff. And I think what's happened is that, like, for many of these costumes, sometimes it's fashion designers designing, and sometimes it's concept artists. And when fashion designers design stuff, they work in a very different way than concept artists. Concept artists come from a background of working with shape, color, light, those kind of things. And that's how they design the things also. So they're like, let's think about some lines here and some shapes and then some color, and then we put it together, and then that's it. Costume designers work with materials and kind of like, and the human form. And they're much more limited in a different way, but also that limitation means that they think way more about material contrast and the play of different materials and the way the stuff feels, because they're feeling it every day. Concept artists don't have that luxury. So if you wanted to, I mean, that's what I think has happened, is that a concept artist has designed stuff. Maybe I'm wrong. It just feels that way. And I think a lot of costume design, I think you if you know a little bit about fashion or look into that thing, you can definitely tell when a concept artist has designed clothes versus when a fashion designer. That's also why there's typically a big difference between the quality of clothing in video games versus in film. Like in video games, I think it's much more evident that clothing feels more wrong and feels more designed and more stylized. And sometimes it can be an issue also for like realistic stuff or things trying to be realistic. They don't have that same quality because they're going for other things like shape and light and color, but they're not really considering material. Just back to this. You've seen this a million times now, but I always try to use material contrast to create interest. So just highlighting that once again, and I use it as much as I can, and I think hopefully to the effect where stuff will feel different from other stuff that you may have seen in the past. I would say there's not that much going on in terms of like value and lighting and color. Like everything is actually quite similar, but in terms of materials, a lot of stuff is going on. You have like this like plasticky, like glass thing contrasting this like rough kind of metallic coppery thing, and that's what creates that interest, is like that impact of two materials from very different worlds like fighting for attention. Then you got this like underlying kind of like woody bone structure or whatever it is, and it's not the value, it's not the color, it's like the material qualities that makes it interesting. And hopefully the result is that it looks different, it looks more unique than other stuff you've seen, and it's not because value and color isn't really helpful. I just think that these things are also important. Oh, missing something there, but don't know where that went. Okay, there it is. I have this sci-fi world that I'm creating, and lots of the stuff is from the sci-fi world, and I always think about material contrast in a way to create interest and play. And very similar to Darth Vader and Darth Sidious, then I'm like, okay, I have an emperor, I have goons in the Empire. They need to feel like they're part of the same faction, so they have the same color scheme, those kind of things. But then maybe I can create some variation in the way that the materials feel. So this is more skin tight, and it kind of has like sparkly nature, and this is more regular. And then within the character itself, there's some material contrast with like, okay, we got this skin suit, and then we got this hair that is just out there, like a very wildly different material than this other stuff. And there we have some material contrast instead of using just color, shape, or values, those kind of things, etc. And there's also other things going on, but I think those are one of the more noticeable things to create difference. And they're subtle, but I think that's what makes them cool. So yeah, basically that's the highlight here. Materials are cool, use them. And that was kind of the thing of like contrast, variety. It was basically just materials, but I think it's just like try to use contrasts in different ways, and there's lots of contrasts that are also really underutilized out there, but I think about all of them. I just think specifically materials, I really care about that. I think that's really cool. Okay, next thing, contrast distribution. So this has to do with a little grief, a little beef I have with this thing called big, medium, small, large, medium, small, however you want to call it. Large, medium, small. Most likely you're all somewhat familiar with the principle of large, medium, small. You have a large shape, a medium shape, and a small shape. You know, so maybe it's all the black here is the large shape, the medium is kind of the white thing, and then the guy is like the small shape. Or here we have large shape and medium shape and a small shape, and it basically is a quick fire way to create some kind of interest. You know, create visual interest because you have different elements of different sizes trying to fight for attention, and it's great. And I think a good way to see it is that big, medium, small is a product of contrast. It's a very natural and easy way to create contrast. However, I don't think it's always clear exactly how you should use large, medium, small, and that's just the thing I want to highlight. And I actually seen lots of interpretations of large, medium, small, and I actually disagree with lots of the interpretations. So here's my interpretation, and see as fit. Let's say you have some kind of distribution of large, medium, small like this. You have a lot of red, you have some gold, and you have a little bit of white. How are we supposed to distribute them on the character? So here is basically the same character, but with these three things distributed in very different ways. Hopefully you're looking at this thing now, and then maybe you have a certain one that you feel like is the most eye-catching, or the most kind of imposing, or the thing that's catching the eye the most. Most people generally say this over here. You know, one thing is sure, he's the first Iron Man, but there's also something in how this is distributed that is different. This first guy over here, the gold is very collected. It's basically like a few areas of gold, and it means that it becomes very evident that it's like red contrasting the gold. Like these are two elements fighting for attention, and they're going against each other in a certain way. You know, like the continuation of the gold makes it one big area of gold, so they have a harsh contrast. Over here, we have not really the same thing going on here. The gold is much more distributed throughout the character, and that almost makes the gold more of a texture than an actual element, right? And what happens is that we have a red guy with gold stuff on it, where over here we have a red and golden man. I hope that you all kind of see what I mean by this. That's kind of the point here. It's like this feels more like a red guy with gold stuff on it, and this feels like a gold and red man, but the distribution is the same, right? So in terms of large, medium, small, they're both fulfilling our distribution, but the distribution is very different, right? So large, medium, small doesn't tell us how to distribute the stuff; it just tells us the ratio. But but our contrast could be wrong. I think is that I think this is a stronger design in terms of like visual interest, but it's not that any of these designs are wrong. It's just that like the different ways of handling distribution, they will create different effects, you know. So this guy over here is more like, it's like I don't know if he's gold or if he's red, but you know, it's kind of like, is he gold with red stripes or red with gold stripes, like a zebra or whatever? It's not entirely clear, and that's just to do with how the stuff is distributed, and we start losing the integrity of like red and gold. It's just more gold and red stuff is happening, but I'm not feeling that contrast in the same way. And here I'm not feeling it in the same way either. I'm feeling it a different way. And none of them are wrong. It makes the design feel different, right? But they're definitely not equal, even though the large, medium, small says they're equal. That's kind of the point, right? So I don't think large, medium, small is a guarantee for creating something that has that striking visual quality. Because I think for example, if you wanted the gold to be really interesting, then I would really collect the gold and make sure that it was in a specific place, and limited to a specific place, so that felt unique. As soon as you start distributing it, it feels less unique, right? A similar example is kind of these 3 images here. They're all great pieces. It's just they're handling the distribution of contrast in a very different way. They all have kind of balancings of like red and white, but most likely your eye is definitely going to this thing over here. You're like, oh, that looks interesting. Oh, that looks interesting. And they're all using large, medium, small, but in different ways. You know, they're distributing the contrast, the harshness of the contrast is very different. Here, like, the distribution is very like white, and then the red cliff wall. We already looked at this. It makes this feel very pristine. Over here, your eye is probably dancing a little bit more around the screen. You're looking a little bit over there, looking a little over there. Maybe you're kind of looking at these things and thinking, okay, that's kind of interesting. But nowhere near as much are you feeling the quality of this thing as you are over here. Down here, it's even more noisy. Like, it's not a bad thing. It's just a different usage of large, medium, small, right? Like the everything's more scattered, everything's more textual. It's just more whatever, which is great if you have something that shouldn't take all that attention. You know, maybe it's like a background, or maybe it's just something that should feel more calm and not as striking as something like this. It's like, I want you to notice the entire city, not the specific area of the city. You know, but large, medium, small doesn't really necessarily tell us how to distribute those things. I think you have to think about contrast to get those things working. And large, medium, small is still great. It's just, it doesn't just like immediately give you the answer. You know, and I see lots of people using large, medium, small, but then they're not getting the level of contrast that's happening over here, because they're like, but I have large, medium, small. Yes, but you're not thinking about the contrast that they're creating. Once again, you've seen this a million times, you know, it's the same thing here. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about like the feeling, right? So for the actual idea for the image is that like this is, you know, the council for a religious cult. And for them, this building is more important than anything else. And it's important for them for everyone else to notice the importance of the religion. So the contrast is very high. You know, it's like the contrast distribution is very, very high, because this is more important than everything else around it. That's important for them, you know. And over here, it's different. It's like basically the same composition, the same values and light, you know, but there's not the same level of contrast. So the image becomes softer, and your eye gets to dance around a little bit more, you know. I still have a little bit of contrast over here, right? But now I have this like duality of contrasts, and that means you're looking at both things, and which makes sense in terms of like storytelling for my piece, because this is kind of the main branch of this religion, but it's not as holy as this place. This is more important in terms of like the religion itself. This is just like a administrative branch of the religion, and that's why this thing over here feels special, because okay, this is a more holy place than this place, right? Sure, this one is bigger and more, you know, spatially important, but in terms of quality, this one is fighting in a very different way, you know. Different kinds of contrast, different kinds of feelings. Once again, in my world, you know, this is like a religious sci-fi building, and it's very important. The contrast is important. Everything else here is not important. This is important. This over here is like a utopian society, right, where everyone is more equal. So the distribution of contrast is way more flat, right? Like there's not a particular spot you're looking at as much as you're looking at this thing over here. When you're looking at both of these images, your eye is probably telling you to still look over here. You want to look at the interest and the intrigue over here, you know. And that's the whole point. It's like you should look here. Where over here, it's kind of like, oh, look everywhere, because everyone's equal. So the way you're distributing the contrast can also help tell and identify the story and give the right feeling of the place, you know. And that's kind of the power of it. And I think large, medium, small is not very good at telling us how to do this, but I think contrast is. So the overall point is just large, medium, small is a great and reliable tool, but it can also be too reliable and lead you down a safe and predictable path of design, you know. It's just use contrast to steer large, medium, small. Don't just rely on large, medium, small and be like, I counted a big shape, a medium shape, and a small shape, I'm done. Because it might not actually work for you. Controlling contrast in all aspects is the real power. That's the thing. Okay, we're reaching the final chapter of this lecture. Oh, just drinking some water here. I hope that everyone is still comfortable. This is when it gets real saucy. It's the best stuff for last. And hopefully you're all learning something, and we're starting to spice up the stuff, and your brain is starting to slowly hurt. And then with this final chapter, hopefully it'll explode. So, more than anything else, I think this is a thing that I've been trying to kind of invent and create into a tool. And what we want to do here is essentially create a lot of intuition from design into something not predictable, but into like a tool where it can be used versus just like, I don't know how I'm doing it, but it feels right, into being like, okay, this works because of this. Okay. So when we're looking at this stuff, I'm also gonna ask you to try out some of these things for yourself. Don't just listen, just try it out as we're listening here. Okay. So this one is a little bit complex, but I should do my best to explain it. It'll rise in complexity, and I think everything will make sense, but it just, you'll have to take a little bit of time to think about it afterwards. Design resonance has to do with the spectrum of designing something visually or emotionally. Okay. And the term design resonance, once again, is just something I made up. You won't be able to go anywhere else and then seeing people being like, oh yeah, design resonance, it's only here. It's the only place where people know about this stuff. Okay. So design resonance has to do with the spectrum of designing something visually or emotionally. And it's a spectrum of things, but I kind of categorize them in these three stages: visual resonance, symbolic resonance, and emotional resonance. Okay? Let's start off with visual resonance, and we can do that with a little exercise. Let's imagine we have a big triangle structure, and we are tasked with creating soldiers associated with that structure. A triangle faction, if you will. So that's our task right now. We have to create a triangle faction. I want you now to just, as you're listening to this, just try to imagine what's the first thing that comes to your head. You're like, how would I make a soldier fit with a triangle visually? You'd be like, okay, I need to make it associated with the thing. Right, just think about that a little bit there. What's coming to your mind? Most people, the first intuition is to say, what if I just give them like a triangle helmet? Then they will be very clear that they have to do with the triangle structure. Or maybe we'll give them like a triangle symbol, triangle cape. I'll use triangles or angular shapes or something visually to associate with the thing. That's probably what you're thinking. If you're thinking about something else, then you're not like everyone else, apparently. But most people say that thing, right? So basically, yeah, just make the character triangle or triangle-like. If we make it becomes very clear that that they are related to the triangle structure, and therefore they start having this like feeling of being a faction. They are harmonious in a way, right? This is visual resonance, right? They have a visual cue and an association with each other. You could also do that with something else like materials or color. If we had a red pyramid instead, we wouldn't have to necessarily make all the people triangles. We could also just make them red. We know this a lot from strategy games or other factions and stuff like this. You just have a visual association with the pyramid. They are red, the pyramid is red, right? We have visual resonance. Okay, that's visual resonance. You have a visual direction. This is something that most people understand, most people do. The problem is that often this is all people do. They just create visual resonance, and then they kind of stop there. They're like, right, in order to make it fit, we'll just have triangles, and then we'll have triangles, or we'll just have red, and then we just have red, and then we're done, And there's some more complicated stuff we can do, which is kind of fun. Symbolic resonance. So now it gets a bit more complicated. But funnily enough, symbolic resonance, people are actually pretty good at doing symbolic resonance. But I'm going to give it this word now to make it into a thing, so hopefully you can think about it and use it as a tool. We do actually have these triangle structures in real life. They're called pyramids. And pyramids also have people associated with them, the ancient Egyptians. But they don't look like triangles. Why don't they look like triangles? Well, that's just because that's not how things were designed back then. But for some reason, we decide to design things like that all the time, even though that's not really how the things work. Okay, but that's also fine. We'll get to that. But basically, there's no correlation there. So what's happening? Why does this feel right, and why does it work? So I bet you that you can look at each of these people, and then you can tell them, and then you can tell me what their buildings look like. You know, what houses are they associated with? You know, like we look at this guy, it's like, okay, an Egyptian guy. You're like, oh, pyramids, Egyptian stuff, pharaohs, sphinxes, those kind of things. You have all these associations that just come naturally just because you recognize this as Egyptian. And none, then suddenly you're going to think about cathedrals and churches and monasteries and other kind of religious things. And those things just come naturally just through this. You get all that for free, and you just understand those things. Native American. TVs, vast landscapes, feathers, horses, those kind of things. These are stereotypes. I understand the stereotypes, but they are visual associations you just get for free because you understand these things about them. This is called symbolic resonance. Symbolic resonance is design grounded in pre-established relations and understandings of visuals in our society. We're really good at this as humans. You all tried this thing where you want to design something that feels religious or something, then you make everything feel cathedral-like, or you make a character that feels priest-like, and then you're automatically going to have all these associations associated with Christianity or whatever, you know, whatever religion, right? And it's going to feel that way, you know. If you design something that looks and feels Egyptian, it's gonna automatically, you're gonna have all those associations to the pyramids, slavery, Sphinx, the Egyptian gods, the Nile, all those cultural associations you're gonna get for free by making something look like that or feel like that, you know. And that's symbolic resonance. That's a different way of creating visual or creating synergy visually. Symbolic resonance. This is a really cool aspect of symbolic resonance. Symbolic resonance can be very obvious in the sense of, like, you see an Egyptian and then you get all these like Egyptian associations. You can also make something that is Egyptian-like. It's not Egyptian, but Egyptian-like. You kind of see that example in Game of Thrones, if anyone's seen that. Then you have these people kind of in Slaver's Bay and have the marine and those things, and there's a certain Egyptian vibe, you know, and it just means that you very quickly, just through the visuals, you understand all these other cultural things associated with them. Like they don't really have to be explained. We just kind of understand it based on what they look like. It's very smart. They could also design them completely differently, but then the explanation would have been harder, where here they just kind of get it for free through the visuals. But this is a shot from Alien, the first Alien film, where they are going into this like crashed spaceship and looking around and finding these like alien stuff. And there's some really nuanced symbolic resonance going on here. So when I was teaching this for students, I was asking people what kind of symbolic resonance they thought was going on here. And lots of people were like, well, it feels creepy. There's some kind of death going on. Well, obviously there's some death going on, and people are like, well, all these shapes kind of have this like gnarly, creepy feeling. I was like, yeah, that's true. People like, maybe like kind of like catacombs or something. Like, oh, okay, that's interesting. You know, you're starting to get these like vibes automatically, and yeah, it's dark and all these things. And then I asked people like, I'm like, okay, this is sci-fi, right? This is science fiction. But then I asked them, is this old or is it new? right? So just try to think about that. Like, is it old or is it new? And then everyone's like, this is old. I'm like, okay, but it's sci-fi. But how do we know it's old? People are like, that's interesting. It feels old. And people are like, oh, maybe it's something to do with the materials. Well, does the materials really... Yeah, sure, they might be dusty and grimy, but I don't think that's the reason why it feels old. There's something about the shape language of the way the stuff is made that makes it feel old, and there's certain kinds of hidden associations and relations that are hiding in plain sight. And maybe you're really smart and you're catching on, but most people I ask, they're not really catching on to this thing that I'm trying to hint at. But I think they're doing this really subtle thing of referencing ancient Egyptians and like sarcophagi. You know, this thing over here is not a sarcophagi, but it ends up kind of feeling like a sarcophagi with this kind of almost lying down position, the depiction of a person on top. And this is actually like a person in a chair, but the way it's been melded together and the associations creates this kind of feeling of this. And I think these lines and stuff that's happening there's some kind of associations here along the top here that feels similar in a way, and we start feeling that association. And the cool thing about it is that we now get that feeling of looking around some ancient tomb without it being an ancient tomb or being Egyptian, but we get all those feelings for free by this stuff feeling kind of like this. And we don't think Egyptian, like that's not that's the goal, to not think Egyptian, but we kind of feel Egyptian. That is the core of symbolic resonance, is that, you know, we're using subtleties in these things in our design, and then we create those feelings automatically. And I think that's super cool. And this is a big spectrum. You know, you can go complex with this, you can go simple with it. The point is that symbolic resonance, we're getting these free associations, etc. And then you're getting all these other thoughts of like, okay, an ancient society, an ancient culture, ancient grand civilization that no longer exists. You're just getting all those and feeling those things for free because they're subtly hinting at that kind of stuff, which I think is brilliant. I think it's absolutely awesome. And there's some things with like death and decay and danger, you know, with like this feeling very skeletal, and skulls feeling kind of death and decay and that kind of stuff, you know. There's also some symbolism there, kind of. And then just, you know, depicting in kind of my own work, then I have this piece here where we have these people arriving at this clearly ancient place, you know, and you feel like it's ancient because of the shape language and the association of gold and that kind of stuff. It reads instantly. And these guys, they have these helmets, you know, and they look a certain way, and they have a vague feeling of conquistadors. You know, they're not conquistadors, but they feel like conquistadors. You're like, right, okay, conquistadors, and that means that all the stuff you know about conquistadors and their culture, you can now impose on these guys. You know, so I can just show you these guys, and they're kind of conquistador-like, and you have all these associations of conquistadors and their kind of culture. And I don't have to write that or explain that. You just know that because they're conquistador-like. You know, and we do this all the time. Like humans are really good at this. Designers are really good at it. It's very common for people to do this thing. I'm just putting a word to it right now. And a friend told me that actually this whole thing of symbolic resonance is essentially just called semiotics, which is a study of symbols and the effect they have on people intentionally or unintentionally. You know, and the meaning and stuff that's derived there. I can see there's a thing in the comment here. Visual resonance. Do you mean semiology? Because what you described is basically the gist of semiology. I don't know, maybe that's semiotics, the thing you said. So visual resonance has nothing to do with semiotics. It's just to do with things looking visually similar. But then symbolic resonance has to do with symbolism and semiotics, kind of. But just the visual aspects. I'm not an expert on any of these things. You know, this is just what I kind of call them. Semiotics, yeah, exactly. So symbolic resonance is I would say it's very similar to semiotics, but just the visual aspect of it. And using it as a design tool is kind of the important thing here. Okay. Symbolic resonance and visual resonance. These are tools you can use in order to create visual harmony between things, or visual contrast, all those things. That's the whole point. Now we get to the third one. It's kind of like, okay, how else can we think about this stuff? We have visual resonance where things are visually coherent. We have symbolic resonance where, like, okay, what else do we have? Now comes the question. What does the soldier look like for this thing? So now hopefully you can all think about this. You know. So the soldiers for these guys, for Star Destroyers, they look like this, right? And then the question is, how does that fit? How do stormtroopers fit with this thing? Do they have visual resonance? No, this one is a gray triangle. These are like white round soldiers. They don't really have any visual resonance. Do they have symbolic resonance? No, they don't really have symbolic resonance either. It's not like you can see these guys and then you will derive that from that, or you'll see this thing, you'll derive that from that. Like, sure, they might have symbolic resonance to something else, but they don't really have any symbolic resonance to this thing. So why do they visually, or why do they work together? You know, why does it work in the context of film? Why would they make a decision like that to bring these things together? They don't really have any coherency. Apparently, that's what it looks like, right? Just think about that for a second. Like, what's actually going on? So, the thing I think that happened is that they did something really stupid. This is back in the 70s, right, when they're designing Star Wars. They were like, you know what? The bad guys, they're triangles. Because bad guys are like triangles and sharp shapes. Super simple. The good guys, they're round. Done. Genius, right? It's like we can make the same material. It's just like bad guys triangles, good guys round things. We learned this in the first part. Now, if you ask me, the round ships look more like the stormtroopers than the triangle ones. They have more visual resonance going on with the round ships than they do with these things, but still, they're still making them go together. So what's happening? Well, I think what happens is that, like, back then they were like, you know what? The most important thing is just that they feel the same. Back then they decided to design each part based on having a similar emotional quality. In this case being the bad guys being dangerous and being deadly. Right? Try to think about that for a second. So stormtroopers and Star Destroyers have a similar emotional resonance, a similar emotional quality, right? A Star Destroyer, it's a big triangle, this kind of thing, essentially has a symbolic resonance to like a knife. You know, that's what at the end of the day, that's what you're feeling. It's like, oh, it's stabby, it's uncomfortable. That's kind of why this feels evil. You know, a stormtrooper is basically just like skeleton warriors, like sci-fi skeleton warriors. That's kind of that's that symbolic resonance. That's like what they resonate with. That's what they're reminding you of. You know, that's what they feel like. Now, these guys don't have any resonance to the Star Destroyer, but the skull has a similar emotional quality to the knife, which is that it's a bad guy, dangerous and deadly. Those things feel emotionally similar, and that's why stormtroopers together with the Star Destroyer, ignore that it says Death Star, together, while stormtroopers and the Star Destroyer each have symbolic resonance throughout, making them work together as a faction is emotional resonance. Right? This is a fundamentally different way than like how most stuff is designed today. I think back then in the 70s we didn't have all this like convoluted design language in terms of like, oh, these shapes they fit together, or these things have or these kind of feel Egyptian, or these kind of, you know, like it was much simpler. It was basically like, you know what's cool? Snakes. You know, it's also cool, swords. Let's put them together. We have sword snake people. and the snakes and the swords have a similar emotional quality, which is that it's cool and dangerous and overall badass, you know. And then you put them together and they have a similar emotional quality, and they have emotional resonance, even though they have completely opposite symbolic or like a visual resonance. They don't look anything alike. But then when they brought together, they have this insanely interesting contrast, right? And I think so much design today is lacking emotional resonance, or like we're not using emotional resonance as a way of like establishing design. We're going through only visual resonance and sometimes symbolic resonance, which are also okay, but we never reached just thinking like, you know what if we just have emotional resonance and we just have, you know, a you know, like very visually different things, but then they have an emotionally similar quality, you know. And it happens sometimes, but I think putting it into words can be really useful to use it as a tool. So the question is, why does a lot of stuff look generic today? And that's kind of the thing that I just said, that I think, you know, we have a way too sophisticated design language, you know, and the design language is very based around visuals, and that's basically all the stuff we talked about in part 1. Like, we're using that to over design the stuff, but the problem with all the stuff we talked about in part 1 is that as designers we often are too busy looking instead of feeling, right? And all those things we just discussed, they're really important, but I think they can also obscure and hide a lot of stuff that what's it called, that is that's actually important, you know, which is like, how does this stuff feel? Does it feel like bad guys, evil and dangerous, you know? That's just something to think about, I think. And I think for me this is just like really groundbreaking for me myself as a designer, to try to break the things apart like this, because it means that hopefully I can make more interesting decisions, because I'm not limited by just making everything visually similar, because stormtroopers and star destroyers are not visually similar, you know, but they still work together, right? And this is the most important thing. All the stuff here that I just said, the code is more like what you would call guidelines than actual rules, you know. These are not rules, you know. They're just ways of thinking about stuff, and the goal is that you can use them as a tool to your advantage, you know. And you might want to think about it in a different way. You might want to word it differently. I think about it like this, and it helps me. And maybe in a year I'll think about it differently, right? But for now, it feels like I'm stepping into a new territory, and I can use it in a different way to design stuff. So just quickly on this stuff on design resonance, I want to highlight how you could potentially use this, because maybe that can be not as obvious. So visual resonance is very direct and clear. It creates a strong connection. It becomes a continuation of the core visual identity. We saw that with the triangle structure. We have a triangle, we're going to make triangle people. Triangle is the core visual identity. We spread it out with triangle people. And an example is basically, you know, Bowser from Super Mario. And all his troopers, they are just mini Bowsers, or you know, turtles essentially. They're the same kind of thing, you know, just bigger Bowser, smaller Bowser. And also the castle is basically just the Bowser fort, you know. There's Bowser there with the shield. There's very strong visual resonance. You know exactly where the stuff belongs. And the thing that it makes us feel like is that, okay, there's a very kind of like, this is Bowser land, you know. It's not like their land, it's Bowser's land, and everyone has to adhere to Bowser, you know. And the cool thing about it also is that, like, if you don't have that much time to explain what's going on, then you can use visual resonance to explain it for you, you know. You're just like, okay, this is what's going on. It's very clear. You might not have the time to say this through like dialogue or these kind of things, and then you can create this very strong visual identity. And sorry. This is very very commonly seen in like stylized stuff, you know, simple things where it doesn't have to be so complex, and for a younger audience or something like that. But I don't think it's only for a younger audience. I think it's also very prevalent in kind of Lord of the Rings, you know. All the structures of Mordor and all the goons and stuff of Mordor, they are basically just Sauron as a building. Very strong visual resonance, right? With these things, like, it's the same shapes, it's the same feeling. And the cool thing about it is that it makes it feel like not necessarily that Mordor is spreading, but more that Sauron is spreading. That Sauron himself is spreading across the land, like when the buildings are like this, and it gives it a very kind of hive mind like feeling, you know. Like if it's almost like Sauron has eyes in here, you know, and this is his mouth, you know. He's spreading himself across the landscape, you know, and it makes it feel very authoritarian. Like there's one person who wants everything to be like him, etc. You know, also reflect the orcs. The orcs are a little bit less so, but they're definitely also sharing that identity, and it makes it feel a certain way. And you can use visual resonance to give that feeling. You know, if all these buildings look really different, it would look more like, oh, the Mordor people are taking over. But actually, I think it's more that Sauron is taking over than Mordor. And I think that's an important distinction for how everything feels. Symbolic resonance is typically something we all do quite automatically. We always design things to be aligned with a certain archetype. You know, that's so symbolic resonance, the thing of like using, you know, symbolism or the things we understand about society. And once again, this is just what I call it. And there's, you know, as long as this is useful to you, then it doesn't really matter what it's called, you know. So I have a friend called Ole, who's also my roommate, Ole Wiedermark, and he did this piece recently. And what he did was that he wanted to design this military fort with these special soldiers. And the thing about these people is that they love crocodiles, and they're like, crocodiles are our thing. That's cool. But then he had a problem. He created this amazing environment, and he had the crocodiles. But then the task became, how do we design the warriors associated with this place? And in this case, the only fixed keyword was crocodile. Right? It's like, okay, how do we do this now? Right? What comes to mind, you know? And some of the first things that come to mind is just like, okay, if we want to make a place, we want to make a warrior, they like crocodiles, maybe they're just crocodile people. You know, that would be a very strong visual resonance to this place. It's like, okay, crocodiles. It just adds up or whatever, right? They could also maybe this is too, maybe you didn't want crocodile people. They could also just have worn crocodile armor, like literally wearing crocodile armor. Could wear crocodile hats. They could have crocodile symbols on them. All these things, all those things would be visual resonance in my book, in the way that we're interpreting this thing, right? There's a visual relation between the things. But he was looking more at this kind of stuff, like doing something more realistic, more grounded. And he could have probably just done this kind of stuff. But then the question became, is there a way we could make it feel crocodile? And we discussed this a lot. I helped him do some of these things, and I kind of made the argument that, like, I think there's a way of making stuff feel crocodile without looking crocodile. And this is kind of where this like spectrum plays into a place. So you have to, there's a certain, you have to go along with this for a little bit here, right? And the whole goal was to be like, okay, let's look at what a crocodile is. You know, a crocodile is kind of like scaly, it has short limbs, it's this like very static creature. It's not a very flexible creature, you know, it's just kind of sits there and then it munches and bites its teeth into something, and it's very patient and it waits and then ambush and those kind of things. We started to think about these qualities and like, okay, now we have these qualities. How can we represent that in a character design that isn't just like putting crocodiles everywhere? So we end up doing this, which looks pretty grounded, looks pretty realistic and stuff like this, but it has very slight crocodilian features, you know. And some of you will probably be like, oh, they're just visual resonance and stuff like this. But I think the point is that, like, if you saw this out of context and did not think crocodile, or did not know about crocodile, you would probably not think crocodile, but you'd maybe feel crocodile. And that's the whole point. So there's things about like the armor is slightly scaly, you know, it's not scale armor, but it kind of has that quality-ish, you know. It's a pretty stiff armor, you know, like it's not this like very shift and elegant. There's this kind of this like the armor stops here, which kind of symbolizes or helps give that idea of like the short stubby arms with the crocodile, kind of the limited something happening with the eyesight in a way where that's being limited, like crocodiles also have their eyes in that way. The weapon is kind of this like basically the closest thing to like a crocodile jaw, you know, etc. This guy he doesn't appear to be like a very flexible warrior, somebody who jumps around. He looks more like somebody who kind of stands still, and then there's like one big hit and then you die, which is very similar to a crocodile. And those are the kinds of associations we're trying to establish to make them feel like a crocodile but not look like a crocodile. There's also some things with the color, etc., here and there. And then when you know about crocodile, you might be like, "Oh, right, I see that." But the goal was to make them be grounded but still have the like feeling of crocodile, and that's kind of symbolic resonance. One aspect of symbolic resonance. It's all a spectrum. It's just hopefully it's just a different way to look at it and to think about how you could maybe approach this stuff. Emotional resonance, right? So it's a really great tool for establishing a lot of visual contrast but still maintaining cohesion. So we saw that with the Star Destroyer and the Stormtroopers. Like the Star Destroyer and the Stormtroopers, they do not look the same, right? But they still have cohesion. And stuff just doesn't look like this anymore, I think. You know, we don't have this level of contrast. Stuff always just look way more cohesive. Like everything is just like, oh, these are the triangle people, these are the gray people, these are the edge angular people. Like you don't get this like level of visual contrast, and it's because people are a little bit too busy feeling, too busy looking instead of feeling. Right? At least in my book. And some designers do this still, you know, and are good at it. But I'm trying to put words to it so that it can become a tool, you know. Other areas also from Star Wars. I think Star Wars is generally just like really aware, but this is Amidala's ship. Oh, yeah, Princess Amidala's ship. But this is kind of what she looks like. It's a very different way of having elegance. You know, this is elegant and expensive and royal. This is elegant and like special and royal in a very different way, right? The emotional quality is the same: elegance, royalty, exquisite, those kind of things. But the way they're achieving those qualities is completely different. So they have a lot of contrast, but they're representing the same things. And then when they go together, it's interesting. You know, she could also have been like chromed and sleek and look like the ship basically. And then they would have a lot of visual resonance. But I think the contrast makes us remember it more. So it's a good tool for iconic design. Also, Lord of the Rings is really interesting. All the bad guys, you know, they have emotional resonance, but they don't have a lot of visual resonance going on here, you know. They don't really, you know, look the same. You know, like Saruman looks the most like Gandalf of everything in the film, but he definitely feels a lot more like Sauron, and maybe not the Balrog, but it feels a lot more like Sauron, you know. And then they have a little notch to like his staff kind of has a little bit of visual resonance going on with Sauron there. Maybe that's a hint for us for this, right? But Sauron, he feels, you know, skeletal and kind of meek, and then therefore he feels a little bit more evil than Gandalf, who's round and that kind of stuff. So the emotional quality is the same. They work together as a faction, and they create interest and contrast, etc., etc., etc. Thank you for paying attention. please clap. I hope that everyone is aware of this meme with Jeb Bush watching what's it called, presenting and then asking people to clap. I always think it's hilarious. Cool. So that was this lecture on creating whatever it is up here, on the principles of visual design. So I hope there was something useful there. There was a lot of stuff there, and it's all very new, and I'm hoping for the stuff to resonate with you guys. Haha, pun intended. And and stuff like that. And there's a lot to digest, and the video will be available to just rewatch. I've also been thinking about making them into actual more condensed videos where everything is more cleanly explained and just like very straight to the point. But it's been great getting to just like hear, to get to have people see it and then maybe comment on it. So that'd be great. Hopefully there's stuff there for you guys to dig into. And there's some things that you're maybe gonna disagree with and be like, oh, that's not really how I want to think about it, or this doesn't really make sense to me, and that's fine. Once again, it's just like, if there's a way of looking at it that can help you make a better decision, then it becomes a tool, right? It's like, okay, let's think about materials, or actually let's think about, maybe we should, maybe you have too much visual cohesion. You're like, oh, these things are really not contrasting. You're like, okay, but then let's figure out a different way. As long as they have, emotional cohesion, emotional resonance, then it's fine. Or those kind of things. And lots of these things end up happening naturally, but not really having like definitions or wordings for them makes them a little bit less predictable. And I hope that by defining things like this, they become tools that you can use, and you'll be like, I can always reach for the emotional resonance tool, or always reach for the symbolic resonance tool, and then hopefully we'll make better design. That's the goal essentially. So thanks to everyone for watching. It's been great. I'm gonna take 10 minutes to kind of round off, so there's not gonna be any more knowledge, but if anyone has any questions or want a clarification or something, then it's your chance to write now. I'll try to explain some things. Otherwise we're gonna dip off into the chill lands here. So etc. Good night, Marcus. See you around. Very interesting. Please clap. Dead. Thank you so much for the lecture. What are we reading here? No Hinderburg. No I just have water. I think semiotics is a little different. Yeah, probably. I think the stormtroopers and Star Destroyers both give off authoritarian vibes, no doubt. But I mean, then the question is like, do they do that because you know it from the films, or do they just do that on their own? That's kind of the hard thing to, and I guess you feel that out when you're designing stuff. You're like, it can be difficult to figure out what exactly. I would say, Star Destroyers and Stormtroopers, they also have a little bit of a natural kind of, aircraft carrier and naval officers vibe, where a lot of naval uniforms are kind of white, and then they kind of feel like Star Destroyers. Right, the Empire is definitely like the good guys, etc. And once again, it's just really important. Like, if you go out in the industry and you're like, let's use some emotional resonance, they're gonna be like, what the hell are you talking about? Nobody talks about this, you idiot. Let me hear what you have to say about shape and light. That's usually what people know and have the capacity to talk about. But then, some people we start talking about these feelings, but not really categorized in this way. And honestly, maybe I'll categorize in a different way in 3 years, or a year, or 3 months, or 3 days, whatever. You never know. But right now I'm rolling with this. It feels fresh and unique to me, and I'm excited about it, and it works for me, and I think that's the thing. And one of the hard things can be demonstrating it working, but I hope that it shows. I think a lot about it in my work, for sure, like these aspects that I'm talking about, and sometimes the things happen by accident, and sometimes they happen by choice. But yeah, Schultz division. Even though we agree on some parts, I still enjoy your progress, and the progress well done, and thank you for your time. Thank you, Schultz. Always welcome. Lovely to have you here. Marcus writes, I think the symbolic resonance is definitely something we utilize already subconsciously, though, so it's good to have to be aware of it. Yeah, I mean, exactly, like symbolic resonance, people use it all the time, and people are really good at it. I think it's just like the natural way that people think. You're like, I'm gonna design some you know, like some Egyptian-like people. They're not going to be Egyptians. They're just going to be Egyptian-like, and then you make them feel Egyptian-like, and then you have certain associations. I think an important difference there, where you can be like, but isn't it all just visual resonance? And then with like, you could see it that way. But when you see a like a fresh design, like something you don't really know anything about, just like, let's say, some random soldier, then you're like, okay, I see the soldier is red and gray. Cool. When you see an Egyptian, your first thought is not necessarily, oh, that's a Egyptian with white clothes, or that's a character with white clothes. Your first thing is like, oh, Egyptian, right? Versus like, oh, I see a red knight, whatever. It's I think a lot of the stuff has to do with like, what do you think of immediately, and then what is derived from that thought, you know. And that's kind of something that layers all of it, but just different ways of like thinking about the stuff. Okay, cool. You know, the tradition is that we went on time. I don't think I did terribly. I was expecting this to take 2 hours of talking time, and I think roughly there. Cool Beans Blaze, thanks for joining. You already knew this, so. We always end these streams on some tax evasion tips. I feel like we have to evade some taxes right now. How do we do that? How do we evade some taxes? It's just a tradition for anyone who is not used to watching the streams. We just ended the streams on tax evasion tips. And the tax evasion tip for this stream is gonna be: find something with a similar emotional quality to taxes, and then evade that. I think something that's similar to tax evasion, or to taxes, is, I don't want to say other bills you have to pay, because definitely sure that feels the same. Maybe something else that's like, you know, jury duty, you know, having to go to jury, and then evade jury duty. That's kind of like tax evasion, just a similar emotional feeling right there. And etc. Schultz, thank you for joining. Have a great one. When is next time? Well, probably Thursday next week. So hopefully back to a similar schedule. Hope that works for everyone. We had a whole class this semester about semiotics, and it's truly fascinating and has helped me look at art and advertisement, etc. in a whole other way. Awesome. Yeah, we never really had anything on semiotics, but I think it's part of society, and I've definitely used it. And for the entertainment industry, I think hopefully what I presented now is a good look at what's being done a lot of the time. So yeah, but I think that's it, guys. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.